Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and over in the Midnight Alpha, we've seen so many different class changes and revamps where some playstyles don't even feel the same. I mean, we'll have survival hunters that are dual wielding and throwing a bunch of fire grenades all over the place. We'll have fire mages that are going back to like a flame fireball turret build, which is super unusual. But other classes are actually going to stay a bit more familiar than what they were compared to like War Within, for instance, just expanding on that original identity with a couple of new talent options. And you would think the class of Druid, the one that could shapeshift into different forms to adapt to different environments, would be the one that changes the most into Midnight, but they're actually not going through like a complete restructure. Instead, they're evolving, taking what they were like in War Within and are finding ways to make those playstyles and those identities that they built up so far better than ever before. And we're seeing this all across the board for Boomkin, Feral, Guardian, and Restoration. For today's video, I want to take a much closer look at the class of Druid as it heads into Midnight. By no means is any of these changes is the final product, and we'll likely see even more adjustments in the future. It's a long video, so I also added chapter marks down below so you can skip around to all the relevant sections from the hero talents, class abilities, and spec-specific talents. But with that being said, if you want to see more regular updates regarding Midnight and all of its class changes, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's take a much closer look at the class that is the Druid. So when talking about all of the changes to one of the most popular classes in the game, I want to start things off with the hero talents first, and there's 4 for us to go over. For Keeper of the Grove, they're not necessarily doing too much, but they are finding ways to uniquely incorporate the 11.2 tier set with some additional bonuses. So for Balanced Druids, Enter an Eclipse summons a Dryad to assist you, dealing additional damage and starfalling the target, but the following talents are a little bit different than the tier set. The Druid's Dance does increase your overall astral power generation, and the final trait allows you to deal additional damage with your Starfall and Star Surge. For Restoration, you get a periodic heals, have a chance to empower your next Swiftman to summon a Dryad which casts Tranquility, so very similar to the tier set, but the bonuses are going to be Dryad causes Swiftman to cool down faster, and the final trait is Ironbark now summons a Dryad to channel a beam of pure nature at the target, healing him over 6 seconds. Moving on, we have the Wildstalker hero spec, which is shared between Resto and Feral Druids, and for them they just added a couple of new talents here and there. First one being Patient Custodian, which increases the effectiveness of your bleeds and dots by 6%, or your healing overtime effects for Restoration Druid. Talents like Green Thumb will increase the rate at which your either Bloodseeker Vines or your Blooms grow depending on your spec, healing effect for healers, the bleed effect for Feral Druids, and then below that is Rampancy, where Symbiotic Blooms have a chance to trigger burst and growth every 2 seconds. The same thing goes for Bloodseeker Vines as well. So a little bit of new talents here and there, but for the most part, the actual talent tree itself doesn't necessarily change. They did end up moving burst and growth to the right-hand side, but I mean, they kind of swapped it out with the talent of Patient Custodian, so it's not like it's necessarily new, just some of the talents are in slightly different locations. With Druid of the Claw, we also have 3 new talents, one of them being Exacerbating Wounds, where Dreadful Wound increases your bleed damage by what seems like a lot, 815%. This may just be like a placeholder number because this is still alpha, but that seems like a fairly sizable bleed increase, at least for the time being. The 2 new talents being added here are also going to be Limb from Limb, where your auto attacks are more likely to cause your next bite or maul to be transformed into a Ravage, so hopefully more regular procs of that Ravage component, as well as Twin Claw, where you have a 60% chance to follow up any single target ability with a Twin Claw effect, which basically just deals additional damage and generates some primary resources. And for specs like Guardian, it does seem like it will also proc from abilities such as Raise as well. And the final hero spec we have is Elune's Chosen, which just basically gets another row of new talents on the right hand side, where they pretty much are incorporating their 11.2 Courage tier set bonus, where gaining astral power for Wrath and Starfire has a 40% chance to launch a Star Surge at a victim, and similar effect for Guardian Druid, but using their base abilities to launch Star Surges as well. With Penumbra as well, your Lunar Eclipse increases arcane damage by additional percent, so it kind of has you evolving more into that lunar nature damage. For Guardian, Lunar Beam increases arcane damage deal by 10% while the beam is active. And below that is Basking Moonlight, which increases Star Surge and Starfall effectiveness for Balanced Druid, but increases Lunar Beam priority damage for Guardian, as well as a maul damage as well. From there, however, we are going to be moving on to the baseline class talent tree, and the talent tree itself for Druids isn't really all that different. It looks the busiest out of all the classes that I've seen so far. Just so many different abilities and so many different pathways. It is just a web of abilities when you take a look at it and compare it to some of the other classes, but they wanted to make sure that I guess it's fairly full for whatever hybrid builds you're looking to play into. There is a number of talents, however, that have been removed from the talent tree here, one of them being renewal specifically, so you only have Ascena's renewal, but the baseline on-use massive heal renewal, that is unfortunately gone. Nature's Vigil, the off-healing ability, which was on the right-hand side here, also gone, so you're losing some of that group capability. But you did gain a couple of new talents and some defensive improvements for Druids in general. One of them being Gift of the Wild, where Mark of the Wilds is 100% more effective on yourself. So above the grants you versatility, that gives you like 3% versatility with a 1 point, which is basically 3% damage increase, 1.5% defensive increase. It's basically doubled. So that's pretty good. I mean, it's a very, very solid buff, and just makes you want to always apply it on your group or yourself at all times, bare minimum. So that's kind of nice. Heart of the Wild has also gone through a wild changes. I know Heart of the Wild being wild and all, but it actually did go through a big set of changes. It is now a 2-minute cooldown that performs a single action ability depending on your current active shapeshift, and depending on the spec that you look at this ability, it has a little bit of variance, but it doesn't really display super well over on the talents. That being said, we do have the full list of abilities you use depending on your form. If you, let's say you are like a feral druid using a non-form ability, the non-shapeshift form, or like the healing form, would allow you to use a stronger version of Wild Growth that instantly heals all allies around you with a healing over time effect. If you're using it in cat form, you unleash an empowered version of Feral Frenzy Bleed to the target, building up to 5 common points immediately, while also rotting the target with a powerful dot. The Moonkin form allows you to call a wave of Starfall immediately, which will deal AoE damage to enemy targets, and Bear form will grant you maximum health bonus for a short bit of time. So they made Heart of the Wild a more active ability that basically grants you like a very powerful effect, depending if you are in a different form. So maybe potentially we'll see Feral Druid shift into Moonkin form in order to get a Starfall for additional AoE damage, which could be really fun. Definitely going to be seeing people shifting to Bear form for additional health bonus that provides, or potentially just shifting out for strong wild growth if your group does need some additional healing. But they are also removing the ability for certain encounters where, like a Feral Druid, could actually offer solid off healing during a certain boss encounter. So there's a bit of this niche playability that is now gone, but I think it does make Heart of the Wild overall a little bit more usable in mostly general content. And we got a couple of defensive buffs as well, with the Talent of Metaphor being one of the more important ones, which now can stack up to 2 times. The absorb effect of it has been greatly increased, so if you're looking for a little bit better survivability, you'll be able to get a lot of it with Metaphor specifically. From that point forth, we can move on to the spec of Balanced Druid and talk about some of their baseline changes and class changes. And I would say Boomkins are the one spec that is probably getting the most amount of love and attention in Midnight so far, which they kind of needed it. Boomkin ball fun and fairly easy to get into. Always had a few quirks that players didn't really enjoy, like your resource generation was always weird, managing eclipses was always awkward, dot management because of your mastery always weird. Like, it's a fine spec, but when you really start diving into like the in-depth parts of this class or this playstyle, it always had these like uncomfortable spots, and they're trying to remove those as best as they can. First of all, Eclipse is no longer a passive effect. It is now separated as a separate spell, which after you press Eclipse, you get to use a follow-up cast of Wrath and Starfire to enter an Eclipse. So instead of casting 2 Wraths or 2 Starfires to automatically do it, you will now use it as a dedicated spell. The ability itself, the Eclipse buff, will last for 15 seconds and will have a 30-second cooldown. So you do have eclipses that are shared too. So you have the solar eclipse and the lunar eclipse, which you could dive into either one or the other anytime you want to. So this gives you a bit more control as to when you dive into an eclipse. And there's also a number of talents to improve the eclipse based gameplay, since it's now as an active ability, but it's more of an active choice that you get to dive into, like improved eclipse, for instance, where lunar and solar eclipse have an additional charge. So if you want to be able to chain lunars or solars, you're able to do so easily. Scope the Stars, which also grants you a slightly shorter cooldown on the CD on eclipses, so you can dive into them a little bit easier. And even talents like Total Eclipse, where there's a chance depending how many points you put into it, up to 20%, to grant both the benefits of both lunar and solar anytime you dive into an eclipse, which buffs the damage of anything that does astral damage. Astral damage is a combination of both nature and arcane, so when both eclipses are active, the astral damage gets to double dip into both of these buffs, which is super nice to be able to achieve both that the lunar and solar empowerment for additional astral damage outside of just incarnation as well. Outside of this, they also made a bunch of different changes to balanced druids as well, where though mastery has been completely reworked, it is now passively amplifies your nature and arcane damage and no longer requires you to have moonfire or sunfire at the target to have full value. Though they still want you to apply abilities like Moonfire and Sunfire in order to be able to actually gain a lot of your damage, but you no longer need to set all of those things up before you can start bursting down a target, which is really nice. But because of this, Moonfire and Sunfire as well as Shooting Stars gain 50% more raw damage. So you still want to be playing dot heavy builds, but you no longer necessarily need to if you need to like instantly switch to a target and burst it down with a bunch of Star Surges as quickly as possible. They've also made a number of good changes, like Starfire always has a 50% damage buff to secondary targets for better cleave, and a lot of the talents to amplify its effectiveness have been removed, so you'll passively have it without having to invest into like a heavy build for Mythic Plus or AoE content. There's also a number of cool new talents that they've added for druids, like Elune's Challenge versus Nature's Grace. When an eclipse ends, then you enter combat, you enter a dream state with Nature's Grace, which basically reduces the casting of your 2 Starfires and Rats by 40%. Or if you play into Elune's Challenge, which could have some skill cap potential or skill expression potential, when you exit Eclipse with less than 40 astral power, Wrath and Starfire's cast times are reduced by 25% for 15 seconds or until you enter a new Eclipse. So if, let's say, you were able to really drain those resources and time it correctly, you can get some really fast cast Wrath and Starfires overall, which could be really awesome. There's definitely an opportunity for skill expression where Nature's Grace is like the easier mode, while Elune's Challenge is an actually challenging talent to play into. There's also a bunch of other cool talents to buff up the effectiveness of your Starfall as well, like Aethel Kindling, where casting Starfall extends the duration of active Moonfires and Sunfires, or you can go Meteor Storm, where Starfire deals its damage 100% faster. So if you want to be able to melt things quicker, you can do so with the new Meteor Storm. Further down, we also have Meteorites, where every time Starfall deals damage, a meteorite falls on a target dealing additional astral damage, which gains benefits from both nature as well as lunar eclipses. And the main Apex talents for Boomkin is going to revolve around the ability of Eclipse to make it even better with the Ascendant Eclipses. Activating an Eclipse makes your next Wrath or Starfire instant, so you can dive into Eclipse very quickly. And the first 3 Star Surges or Starfalls cast during each Eclipse deal 20% increased damage, so you get a lot of your burst value front-loaded during an Eclipse. Below that is the second variation with a passive version where critical strikes during an Eclipse cause your victims to also take additional damage over time, so there's some crit scaling with it. And the final trait of that Apex talent, activating an Eclipse also launches a solar or a lunar bolt at the enemy within 40 yards that always critically strikes. Entering Solar Eclipse launches a Solar Bolt that deals a bunch of instant damage, and a Lunar Bolt launches 3 mini Lunar Bolts that would deal AoE damage with a soft cap of 5 targets. So there's even additional bursts for you to dive into Eclipses and play around the affixes a lot more aggressively, but also making it easier for you to be able to enter Eclipses and gain full value out of them, especially when it comes to burst damage. For Feral Druids, when it comes to their changes, there's definitely some adjustments to the talent tree in terms of where abilities sit, and a couple of little talents that are like nice little buffs here and there, like Panther's Guile, but for the most part, what you need to know about Feral Druids is changes to their snapshotting. Snapshotting basically means certain buffs allow you to put up bleeds that retain their full damage value even after you lose those buffs. And there's a lot less effects that play around snapshotting specifically. Blood Talent, for one, has been removed. You can buff your bleeds effectively by 10% with Lacerating Claws, but you can no longer set up like a big snapshot damage. Even Sudden Ambush got redesigned so you no longer have a snapshot effect, which means Tiger's Fury is your only snapshot ability available. It'll be even more important for you to line up big bleeds around your Tiger's Fury specifically. Feral Druids gain a number of new talents such as Hunger for Battle, where you actually have a damage buff as more targets die, which could potentially be niche in some Cleave fights or ad fights, or possibly in Mythic Plus situations. With talents like Blood Splattered, you actually gain even more bite focus damage as you put more bleeds on enemy targets, which again is going to be ideal in Mythic Plus. And the new version of Ashermane's Guidance actually changes the way that Incarnation functions to take it from a 2-minute cooldown down to a 1.5-minute cooldown passively, which is really strong, which gives Feral Druids a little bit more flexibility around being a 2-minute burst class or like a 1.5-minute burst class instead, which allows them to hit different breakpoints and encounters easier. And as somebody who plays a lot of classes that are 1.5-minute burst classes, it does feel like the flexibility of that short of a window for burst is super nice and tends to line up with raid encounters a lot better. For Feral Druids, you will be seeing some abilities that they've had for a while actually removed, such as Brutal Slash is gone, as well as Adaptive Swarm. But they have been replaced with a number of some abilities that you'll be able to play into, like Chomp for instance, which sits on the same choice note as Lunar Inspiration. Chomp is an interesting skill with a 20-second cooldown that allows you to chomp the enemy for a quite hefty bit of damage, but can only be used whenever you have less than 30 energy. So it's going to be an ability that plays around with resources in a fun new way. The talent of Feral Frenzy is same as it was, but it now has 2 new upgrade nodes, specifically Focus Frenzy that allows it to have a shorter cooldown, so it better lines up with things like Tiger's Fury for much better single target synergy. Or you can go for Frantic Frenzy, which transforms the ability into an AoE skill instead, granting Ferals some much needed AoE presence. The apex talents for Ferals is Unseen Predator, which adds up to a 70% chance for your bites to proc Unseen Strikes. This talent also encourages 5 common point investment into every single one of your bites as well, and the effect itself, the ones you bite, if you proc it with Unseen Slash or Unseen Swipe, you either put a pretty strong primary target bleed or swipe nearby enemies if you're fighting in an AoE encounter. Unseen Strikes could further actually grant you a damage buff every time it procs as well, which can roll into itself over and over. And the final trait allows Tiger's Fury to also proc unseen attacks more regularly, plus it's also a fairly sizable buff towards rip bleed damage as well, which could be potentially really good to set up some nice big burst every 30 seconds as a Feral Druid. From there we have the spec of Guardian, which saw a couple of talents removed, but also some new additions as well. Some of the talents removed were things like Tooth and Claw, which is unfortunate as it was a talent that players utilized. Thorns of Iron, which allows Ironfur to deal damage to targets, which is actually kind of welcome change because it allows Guardian Druids to play into a less APM heavy playstyle. They also gave him improved survival instincts by removing that talent, but making those 2 charges baseline. A lot of the Berserk talents like Persistence and Unchecked Aggression are now just part of the baseline Berserk ability generally. And also the lost talent of Earth Warden, which was actually a very useful one, so that one is kind of a sad loss. However, Guardian Druids do go back to a playstyle where they don't really need to maintain multiple stacks of Ironfur. They just need to have 1 defensively, potentially a couple more if you're looking to take a huge melee hit from an enemy, but there's going to be some limited setups where you actively have to do that. But for the most part, you'll spend your rage into 1 stack of Ironfur and dump the rest of it into Maul and Raise, which means a little bit more offensive pressure. You also got a number of talents which have some viability depending on the situation. Some are a little bit more niche than others, like Persistence for instance. Like when you shapeshift out of bear form, your health and armor bonuses will slowly decay, you don't lose them immediately. There are some situations where Guardian Druids could shapeshift out of form for a unique ability or two, like to deal more damage or potentially more off healing. There's not a lot of the situations as they made a lot of those skills available to be cast while in bear, but there are some situations where you want to do some hybrid capability, like shift into Boomkin form, pop a Starfall, pop back into bear form maybe for more AoE damage. The Persistence will let you do a little bit more of those risky plays without really being overly punished for it whatsoever. Talents like Memory of Viscera allow you to convert a rage spend into a solid healing over time for yourself. You have a new talent of Ward of the Forest, where Barskin can now increase your maximum health, but give it a small duration, which could potentially be good in some niche anti-magic big hit situational effects. Gift of the Ancient Guardian just provides you a nice bit of mastery as long as a stack of Ironfur is on you at all times. And they even given them some interesting flavor buttons that have this Emerald Nightmare feel about them, like Red Moon, which is on the same row as Twin Moonfire, where Red Moon is a 30-second CD that channels the power of Enraged Moon to deal arcane damage to the target, where casting Mangle extends the duration and generates additional rage. with the talents of Harness Rage, which is really good for consistency as it grants you Mangle an additional charge and gives you Maul, cast at 80 Rage, a chance to activate Gore as well, which is super nice and improves rotational downtime. Waking Nightmare as an ability is actually an interesting AoE tool that potentially could have some good value. And Sundering Roar is a very short CD ability with big threat generation opportunity, so it's potentially going to be really good for Guardian Druids in Mythic Plus content, like when you're rushing into a pack and you want to get snap aggro as quickly as possible. The Guardian Druid Apex talent is Wild Guardian. After Berserk or Incarnation ends, you gain the buff of Wild Guardian, causing your next 2 casts of Iron Fur, Maul, and Frenzied Regen to be echoed at 50% effectiveness. The further part of this buff increases your mastery by 3% per stack, and also Wild Guardian echoes your abilities now cast at 100% effectiveness. And with the final node, Wild Guardian echoes are further upgraded, where Iron Fur now grants you an Absorb Shield, Frenzied Regen grants you Dream of Scenarios, and Maul does 50% additional damage over 12 seconds. And the final spec on the list is going to be Restoration Druid, which is going through a few changes, but for the most part, they're really just trying to simplify healers a little bit heading into Midnight. For Resto specifically, they're looking to limit some of the various different buffs they can apply to their allies, primarily limiting them down to potentially at most 5 healing overtime effects they could put on a single ally. But they're also going to be buffing mastery as well as the healing effectiveness of those effects in order to make up the difference. Just not make them like too overloaded with too many hots that need to manage at once. As for some of the new tools that Residuals will get to play into in Midnight, at least for the time being, Nature's Bounty allows Regrowth to heal all other targets affected by Regrowth for 30% of its healing. So if you're able to like heal one person, then the next, that regrowth will continue to cleave to all the other targets that have been previously affected by regrowth as well. They're also looking to heavily invest into Life Bloom as part of your core skills, especially when we're talking about Apex talents. But to make Life Bloom even easier to work with, they have Life Treading, where Efflorescence will now become a passive, where healing is increased, and it now automatically grows beneath your Life Bloom target's feet. So it makes it a little bit easier to manage your Efflos. We also have a new talent like Intensity. When Regrowth critically heals, it's 300% effective instead of 200%, so it gives you some heal crit value and playstyle options. Grove Guardians are now spawned passively instead of actively, and there will be someone from casting Swiftmans or Wild Growth specifically. Tranquility no longer has a healing over time effect, but it now has more of an immediate effect specifically, so it's going to be a little bit more front-loaded rather than giving you an extra healing over time to add to your allies. And the main Apex talents for Restoration Druids is going to be Everbloom, which heavily leans into Life Bloom. Life Bloom will stack every 5 seconds up to 3 specific additional times. Further down, it allows Life Bloom to have a 15 to 30% chance of the Life Bloom's healing to splash to 2 allies within 30 yards. And with Everbloom final capstone trait, Life Bloom bursts into a blooming frenzy when you consume Soul of the Forest, causing it to bloom 5 times in rapid succession. They did remove the talents for you to be able to put Life Blooms to 2 targets specifically, but positioning Life Bloom on the correct target and being able to proc it with things like Blooming Frenzy, it could potentially be really good and add some much needed burst healing for Rested Druids that they may be able to use on demand, which can either heal the tank or potentially somebody in your group that is going to be under a ton of pressure. But with that, as always, I want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys did enjoy this update. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like, as I would very much appreciate it. Also helps the channel out tremendously. Also, be sure to join our Discord community, especially if you just want to keep up with any regular newest updates over on the Midnight Alpha, which will hopefully be going into beta testing period sometime soon, based on what some of the Blizzard employees have said so far. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.